Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being with us. My name is Suhad Baba. I'm the Executive Director and President of Just Vision. We're a team of storytellers, filmmakers, and organizers who have a laser-sharp focus on filling a media gap on Palestine and Israel. And I'm very, very pleased to be moderating today's conversation. Today's session is called The New McCarthyism, Tactics of Repression and How We Resist. As many of you know and likely have been following, despite ceasefire resolutions from the UN Security Council proceedings unfolding at the International Criminal Court and International Court of Justice, charging Israel with genocide and its leadership with war crimes, mass protests in the US, etc., and beyond, the Israeli government continues, backed, funded, and armed by the United States, to commit war crimes in Gaza and commit an unprecedented genocide on its people. In response, we've seen an upsurge in mobilization and rapid growth of a movement concerned with Palestinian rights here in the United States and around the globe. In the US, activists have shut down highways, organized encampments, shut down train stations, and shifted the conversation on Palestinian rights in ways that have been new, moving, and inspiring. But with that momentum, we've also seen intense backlash. Organizations have been defunded, advocates have been illegally detained and deported, and individuals have been criminalized, fired, and vilified, simply for calling an end to a genocide. It's important to contextualize today's conversation about the new McCarthyism in a broader arc of history. Repressive tactics and strategies on progressive organizations and movements aren't new. From COINTELPRO to post-9/11 surveillance to anti-BDS laws, US institutions and power holders have long used states and civil society tools to suppress transformative movements. We know that that's the case. Palestine, however, in today's day and age, has become an unprecedented testing ground for repression. Tactics tried here are routinely exported and turned against other movements. And so the work that our panel today is set out to do is to really discuss what that backlash and repression has looked like for those who are concerned with Palestinian rights. What are the roles that funders, lawyers, and organizers who care about this issue and care about our movements at large, what can they do to flank movements at this defining time? How do we navigate this, sustain this, and continue to build momentum? And so we have an incredible group of folks who have joined me today as experts to help us do that. Alicia Sanchez-Gill, Executive Director of Emergent Fund; Vince Warren, Executive Director of the Center for Constitutional Rights; Dylan Saba, Staff Attorney at Palestine Legal; and Rabbi Alyssa Wise, Founding Director of Rabbis for Ceasefire. I'm going to want to go ahead and jump right in. The format for the conversation today is going to be pretty straightforward. I'm going to ask a few questions of our panelists to get the ground kind of fertile and warm, and then we're going to open up to Q&A. You all have index cards that are either circulating or on your seats. Feel free to go ahead and ask questions on those cards. Lauren, who's in the orange shirt in the back, is going to be incredibly gracious and generous and help us collect those. And I'm going to be turning to your questions during the second half of the conversation. So with that, I want to go to Vince. Vince, as the Executive Director of the Center of Constitutional Rights, you and your team have been at the forefront of defending organizations that have been targeted for their support of Palestinian rights, certainly over the last couple of years, but it's truly been a decades-long struggle and fight at CCR. I want to ask you to set up the stage for today's discussion. Can you give me a big picture understanding of what is the legal infrastructure behind these attacks, and how does it reflect an authoritarian shift in today's kind of context?
All right, thank you so much, Suhad. It's great to be with this amazing panel. How y'all doing? That badly? How y'all doing? Yeah. Yes, people are still hungry or food comaing, so we're gonna fire it up here, so we need a little energy from you. So the legal infrastructure, and actually CCR, Center for Constitutional Rights, has been really waging this battle for about 30 years, and it has come to a particular point of action, and I think, like you were saying, Suhad, I'm very excited to see all of the energy and momentum. The tide is turning. People are beginning to realize that people are having the fights at home and at work that they were not willing to have a while back. So that's all great. But the infrastructure thing is sort of as follows, is that the broad thing is weaponizing money and the law, which is sort of the big picture thing that's happening. And what do I mean by that? The United States and their policy support. So, $3.8 billion a year to Israel and doing everything that they can to shield them from legal accountability. Their international laws and domestic laws, like the Leahy law that says you cannot actually fund countries that are committing human rights abuses, and that's not being applied to the anti-boycott laws, 30 states. Smearing and surveillance, that what's being weaponized in terms of the law is the concept of anti-Semitism, which has been in play for a very, very long time. It's been a pitched battle, as many of you know, for a long time, but what we're seeing now is our worst nightmare of what happens when people did not take a side on that issue, which is you walk down the street and you have a Palestinian flag and all of a sudden you're an anti-Semite. And it's one thing if it's just happening individually, but when it's happening on an industrial scale, on a massive industrial scale, where not even just activists like us or legal organizations, but entire universities, entire law firms, basically the corporate entities that we spend a lot of time trying to get in line, they're the ones that are being targeted. That tells you about the power of that particular move. Anti-protest laws, we saw them after Dakota Access Pipeline, we saw them during the Civil Rights Movement, we're going to see them again. And they're going to be specifically focusing on advocacy in support of Palestinian rights. So that's coming in season 2, so we have to get ready for that. A number of other things, but I want to just sort of add a couple of things, which I think is super important. One is the question of dissent. We have a very complicated relationship for a country that was supposedly was founded on slavery, but it was also supposedly founded in a revolutionary spirit, where dissenting is as American as figure out the last part of that sentence. But we have a very difficult relationship with dissent, particularly when it goes up against the power structures. Not the individuals, not necessarily the elected officials, but the power structures. And so we have kind of two challenges. One is we're advocating in the context of, for example, Mahmoud Khalil, who was a client that my organization represented, got him out of detention from this state. Yes, we did. In the general discussion, what people feel comfortable saying is, well, dissent is protected by the First Amendment, so it's a difference of opinion, and you can't deport somebody because you disagree with their opinion, and I get that. But the real piece of it is that it's not just a difference of opinion. Mahmoud Khalil, all of us are speaking facts and speaking the reality that millions of Palestinians have to deal with, and we're speaking truth. And what's happening is that the truth that we're speaking becomes the criminal act. And so that is not new to authoritarianism, but I think it's something for us to remember, even as we hold the banners that say dissent is American. That plays to a lot of people that need to be shifted, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it's not just dissent. We are calling for human rights accountability. In the right circumstances, calling for the humane treatment of other people can never be dissent and shouldn't be considered dissent. So I want to throw that out there. And then the other thing, thank you, the other thing is the terrorist thing. So CCR, we've done a lot of stuff over 60 years. One of the things we did 20 some odd years ago was represent men after 9/11, including Guantanamo detainees. And one of the things that we saw there was that was one of the many phases in US history where the terrorism frame was brought in to bolster the question of national security, to kick the issue out of the courts, and to create a political division between, to be able to build power. And so anybody that was Muslim and Arab 20 years ago was a terrorist. This man comes back, he's the president now, he's like anybody that's Muslim or Arab is a terrorist. And in addition to that, whether you're a Muslim Arab or not, the framing around terrorism, particularly around Palestinian advocacy and human rights advocacy, has been around for decades. And in fact, there's evidence that the reason why it's being applied has been essentially because the Palestinian cause has been so deeply ingrained in the U.S. that they needed a way to sort of think about exporting the sort of terrorism framework that was being floated by Israel, importing it into the United States and labeling them and us all as terrorism, which triggers the national security response, which then makes everybody afraid. And so the idea of having dissent both as a freedom of speech protection and having dissent being framed as terrorism are kind of two sides of kind of what we're swimming in terms of the legal infrastructure.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Can you all hear me? Yeah? Okay, cool. Thank you for setting us up. I want to actually turn to Alyssa. Alyssa has been really kind of at the forefront of Rabbis for Ceasefire, which came together, in the wake of the genocide, where more than 60,000 Palestinians have been killed. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands more, are continue to be missing under the rubble, dying of starvation, illness, disease, under genocide that we have that is unprecedented in scale and scope. You've also been one of the team leaders at Jewish Voice for Peace, and so much of your organizing within the Jewish community has come into a very visible place over the last couple of years. I want you to talk to us about that, and specifically, drawing on what Vince just shared with us around the weaponization of anti-Semitism. How is that playing out? What are you seeing both in the organizing spaces that you're in, and what is there for us to be holding in this room around what that looks like and how we navigate it?
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So there's a joke inside the Jewish community, which some of you may have heard, which is if you talk to two Jews, you'll get at least 3 opinions. And it's actually really true. And I lead an organization of 400 rabbis, so I really should know just how true that is. The number of opinions I end up having to deal with a group of that size. And I raise that just to say that it's really important, and I want to emphasize this particularly for people in the room who are not Jewish, right? That part of what that means is you need to make up your own mind on questions around the Jewish community, because there is no consensus in the Jewish community around anything, and in particular around questions as they relate to Israel-Palestine and the question of anti-Semitism. And in the Jewish community, there has never been consensus on this question of Zionism. The exact same year, 1897, right, that's how old political Zionism is in the Jewish community, the first Jewish World Zionist Congress met, and that same year, the first anti-Zionist Jewish socialist convening of the Jewish Labor Bund met in the exact same year. So we've never had a time in the Jewish community where there hasn't been both disagreement about the question of Zionism and anti-Zionism as a feature of Jewish communal discourse. So I want to say that because I feel sometimes, and I think this is prevalent in the way that, and I say the way identity politics has played out, especially on the left and progressive movements, you want to follow the lead of directly impacted, but that's not actually really possible when it comes to the Jewish community on this issue. So you are going to need to have your own values and your own principles and make your own decisions, right? You can't turn to be like, I'm going to follow what the Jewish community is doing, because there's a lot of diversity in the Jewish community. And I think in this political moment, like, part of this, I'm a rabbi, so you'll forgive me or indulge me, that there actually is a spiritual dimension to the work that we have to do in this moment. And I think in particular, some of the way that I think that spiritual work needs to manifest is by really practicing how to hold complexity. We're not going to have easy answers. We need to be able to hold two things that don't go together at the exact same time. And I see that as a spiritual challenge, and I think we can rely on our traditions to support us. So, for example, the things that I'm thinking about, and you could develop your own list, is we are at a time where people are scared and overwhelmed at this authoritarian regime, again, taking leadership in our country, and people have been taking consistent, bold actions to refuse it. Over the past 2 years, there has been nearly 2 years, nonstop organizing to stop this genocide, and it hasn't led to the end of the genocide, and in fact, the genocide is increasing and escalating. The Jewish community, on the one hand, is profoundly and I think irredeemably ruptured by this genocide, and literally last week, a quasi-consensus has emerged in the Jewish community around the line of starvation and needing to stop this human-made, Israel-US-made forced starvation of the Palestinians in Gaza. And when it comes to the question of anti-Semitism, holding this complexity is also challenging. Because on the one hand, anti-Semitism is a very real old form of hatred that still is manifest in our society and culture in deadly and dangerous ways. And anti-Semitism is used as a cudgel to shut down critique of Israel. And so to offer just a definition to work with, I think there's a very simple way to understand anti-Semitism, which is it's hatred of Jews as Jews. And I think it's very hard for a lot of us who are, anybody, I think, who has been vocal in solidarity with Palestinian rights has been lobbed with an accusation of anti-Semitism, right? You could raise your hand here if that has happened to you, right? And that is Jew and non-Jew alike, right? And this is dangerous, actually, for Jews, right? Because what it does is desensitize people to actual anti-Semitism, right? When the idea of anti-Semitism is opposing genocide, is opposing mass murder of children and families in their refugee tents, it loses all meaning. And so then when there actually is anti-Semitism, when you have right-wing conspiracy theorists shooting Jewish worshipers in a synagogue, right, it's actually very difficult. So as a rabbi who's dedicated my life to caretake Jewish people, I'm furious and worried and really committed to us being able to kind of hold the complexity of the question of anti-Semitism as a progressive movement, because I think it's a liability to us if we're not able to do that. And there's also a false choice that we're actually often asked to be made between standing in solidarity with Palestinians and solidarity with Jews, right? In my mind, opposing this genocide is an act of solidarity primarily for Palestinians, and it's an act of solidarity for Jews. There's no reason why people should allow the Jewish community to get off the hook for the mass murder that so many are honestly championing, and this is a very painful reality. This includes people in my own family, right? That my brother and my family members who are doing that. And it's not the primary reason that you should speak out, but it's actually really important that you do so. And so to frame your genuine concern for the genocide in Palestine as an act of anti-Semitism is an effort to weaponize good intentions, right, of people who actually are like, I'm not trying to be anti-Semitic, right? and it weaponizes that into tolerating ethnic cleansing and murder and starvation of Palestinians. That's right. So just to be clear, I do not believe that it is anti-Semitic to decry this genocide. And in fact, the way that the Trump administration is approaching dealing with anti-Semitism, that is in fact anti-Semitic, right? And that's actually, I think, really important. The way that Trump is exploiting reasonable Jewish fears to further his anti-democratic agenda and making Jews the face of his authoritarian crackdown, right? So this authoritarian crackdown is because he cares about Jews, and that actually is anti-Semitic in the way that he's perpetrating that. I don't believe that Trump or his administration care about Jewish safety, right? And they don't. And this has I know we don't have time to go deeply into this, and maybe if there's questions in the Q&A, but I just want to point out that the evangelical Christian base that animates Trump administration, that is actually the root of political Zionism as we know it today. Before there was Jewish political Zionism, it was an effort of the British Parliament, who was then in control of Mandate Palestine, and it was because they wanted to instrumentalize Jews to accelerate the coming of Jesus, it's an instrumentalization that is like, at that point when that happens in their imagination of the end times, Jews will have to either convert en masse or burn, and there's literally nothing more anti-Semitic than that. I mean, and so we're still kind of in that dynamic with the evangelical Christian Zionist community, and they hold the lion's share of power when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, particularly at this point. The Christians United for Israel, the largest pro-Israel lobby in the U.S., has more members than the entire Jewish population of the United States. There's about 7 million Jews in the U.S. There's 11 million members of Christians United for Israel. So when we think about how power is really playing out, we actually have to have a realistic assessment of that. And I point that out because I think a lot of people are waiting for Palestinians and Jews to lead this movement. And for those of you or any of you who are listening online or are here who are part of Christian communities, I just want to say this is your responsibility. And there are new emerging Christian organizations like Christians for a Free Palestine that are starting to take up the mantle around that. And I think I'll just close by saying it really plainly, is that deporting, incarcerating, and terrorizing students does not combat anti-Semitism. That's just not how it works. You don't combat anti-Semitism by dismantling constitutional protections. In fact, Jews are more safe in society where there are minority protections. That's how Jews have actually been safe in the United States more than in other places throughout the world. Deporting international students for speaking out for Palestine does not combat anti-Semitism. Firing people for standing up against this genocide does not combat anti-Semitism. So I think being confident in being able to assert what is and what isn't anti-Semitism, and being able to be willing to step forward, and even though you will get pushback and there will be blowback, right? And so your organizations should not do this in a cavalier way where you go really strong, right? Because you will get pushback, and so you need to be able to be prepared, and you can come talk to some of us afterwards so we can help prepare you. But it is essential that every organization in the progressive movement is participating in refusing the ways in which the Trump administration is making Jews the face of his authoritarian crackdown, and using these lawfare, which I'll let the lawyers talk to more significantly, as a way to silence us around this genocide and allow this genocide to continue. So it's up to us to refuse that, and I hope that you will.
Thanks so much, Alyssa. And you all can clap. You're allowed. Thank you.
Thank you.
You actually set me up to turn to Dylan, who is at Palestine Legal, which for those of you who don't know Palestine Legal, they are one of the premier outfits that are defending students, organizers, and institutions that are facing repression for their support of Palestinian rights. And there is no other place in the United States right now where the debates and instrumentalization of anti-Semitism and repression is playing out at greater scale than on campuses. And so I want to just really turn to you. You've also just written very extensively around how national security has been used as a tool to suppress dissent. Can you walk us through how that plays out and what you're seeing at Palestine Legal?
Yeah, first of all, thank you all for being here. It's an honor to be on this really amazing panel and with you all today. So I want to start we heard a term lawfare, and it's a kind of nebulous term, so I want to just kind of offer some grounding around that, and then I'll talk about how it plays out in the national security context around Palestine. And a lot of my comments are going to actually be building on some of the scaffolding laid out by Vince, and I think it's really important that we bring together both the conversations around anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitism smear and around national security framework and the terrorism smear, because those are really the two principal avenues of suppressing pro-Palestine speech in the United States. And it's important to talk about them together because they operate together. So I'll first start with lawfare. So what is lawfare, right? Lawfare is the weaponization of the legal system to achieve particular political objectives. And we might actually more accurately say it is a strategy of leveraging unequal access to the legal system in order to achieve political objectives, because the law is always political in a certain sense. But in concrete terms, what that looks like in Palestine is leveraging different strategies in different areas of law to silence dissent, to silence advocacy for Palestinian rights and Palestinian liberation. So that shows up quite prominently in the criminal law. So that is the use of laws around material support for terrorism, which is a law we'll talk about probably in more detail, to go at solidarity with Palestine, to try and break the bonds of transnational solidarity and criminalize certain forms of political advocacy and political dissent. It also shows up in the civil law, right? So that's baseless civil lawsuits that are leveraged at movement actors or movement groups to falsely allege some support for terrorism. You may have seen this, like there were some headlines around some of these lawsuits brought recently making ridiculous claims that like Columbia students had advance notice of October 7th and were coordinating their Instagram stories with them or something. Those kinds of lawsuits we see, and they may seem laughable, and sometimes they are kind of comedic in how outlandish the accusations are, but the way that they work is they tie up movement groups, right? Groups that are faced with these lawsuits do have to defend themselves. That takes resources in terms of time, it takes resources in terms of money, and that's why when I say unequal access, that's what I'm talking about, right? Pro-Israel advocacy organizations have a lot more lawyers to throw at these cases, a lot more money to throw at these cases. And if they can jam up these movement orgs in defending themselves against these baseless lawsuits, they can stop these organizations from doing the really critical work of building solidarity around Palestine. That's right. And then the third kind of avenue of lawfare that we're seeing very prominently right now is around immigration. Right, so immigration kind of exists somewhere between the criminal and the civil avenues, is a space where the federal government has a lot more leeway in terms of what they can get away with, right, as opposed to the kinds of consequences they can bring to bear on US citizens. And so that is incorporating advocacy for Palestine and criticism of US support for Israel into the immigration system itself by creating bases for denying visas or for revoking immigration status or even for deporting people by engaging in that kind of political advocacy. So that's what we mean when we're talking about lawfare, and that's kind of like some concrete examples of where we're seeing this stuff show up. Now the question of why, right? Why the national security framework? What is that doing for the Israel advocates or for opponents of Palestinian liberation, both private actors and public actors? Well, the first thing is something that Vince mentioned, right? Nominally, we have freedom of speech in the United States, right? First Amendment supposedly protects our rights to engage in free speech and in political dissent, political organizing. The government is not supposed to be able to engage in viewpoint discrimination, right? So when the target here is a political viewpoint, and I agree with Vince that it's a lot more than that. When we're talking about solidarity with Palestine, we are not just talking about a difference of opinion. We are talking about US imperialism. We are talking about social justice. We are talking about all sorts of things that extend beyond, mere speech, right? But it is fundamentally political expression that the government is targeting. And so in order to do that without explicitly violating the First Amendment, they have to carve out end runs around the protections that the First Amendment are there to put in place. And so in the national security context, they do that by telling the courts, essentially, that this is not just about speech. This is about our national interests. This is about threats to national security. And that's how they frame things that would otherwise be squarely political advocacy as being something that they call material support for foreign terrorist organizations. So what they're doing is they're saying it's not just speech that you're doing. You're actually, by expressing these ideas and engaging in this advocacy, providing a service to a foreign organization. Now, we know that philosophically, morally, legally, this is a bankrupt argument, but they have had some success in advancing it. By they, I mean the opponents of Palestinian liberation, have had success, and also liberation for oppressed people elsewhere, as we'll talk about, have had some success in getting away with their end runs around the First Amendment by going with the national security framework. Now, the other key component here, and the other reason why the national security framework is successful, is because it creates a deeply racialized mechanism for oppressing Palestinian and suppressing advocacy and support and solidarity with Palestinians, right? And that's really essential, and it's really essential on a narrative level for why they can justify or get away with treating Palestinians and Palestinian advocates the way that they do. And this is, frankly, quite a long story of the deeply racialized way that Palestine and Palestine advocacy has been tied in with the security framework and the national security framework. And there's some longer reports that Palestine Legal actually has produced in conjunction with CCR around this. But I'll just give one example that demonstrates how far back this goes and how deeply rooted it is. The first time that terrorism ever showed up in a federal statute in the United States was in 1969. This was a law that prohibited the provision of some humanitarian aid to Palestinians. The law basically was a law that said no UNRWA funding, and UNRWA is the UN agency that was created to meet the needs of Palestinian refugees. The law said that no U.S. UNRWA funding can reach the hands of terrorists, can go to support terrorism. Now, in that statute, terrorism is not defined. And the only way that it is that is defined at all is by reference to Palestinian refugees, right? So there's no definition of terrorism, but they give an example, and the example they give is that any Palestinian refugee who has undergone any kind of military training. That is the fundamental definition of terrorism from its first instance in U.S. law. And what that does is it sets up this equation, basically. It's connecting Palestinian identity to refugee status to terrorism. And that has permeated and continued all through, from the late 60s up through the present, in immigration law, in all aspects of U.S. law, in the federal, quote unquote, counterterrorism legal infrastructure. And I raise that just to show how far back it goes, and also to dispel a notion that all of the counterterrorism, police state, surveillance, et cetera, all comes after 9/11, which is a misconception, and it's not true. This goes back much further, and a lot of this infrastructure has been anti-Palestinian from the beginning and using a very deeply racialized logic in order to justify the repression, and that continues to today.
Dylan, thank you for the encyclopedic knowledge. With that, I want to, before I jump over to Alicia, I want to just turn to Vince. Is there anything that you might want to jump into on this that dovetails, given the close work of CCR and Palestine Legal?
Well, first of all, I think that was extraordinary.
Yeah.
Dylan.
Oh my God.
Really, really
Yeah.
great.
Amazing.
And very, very clarifying. I would add that, particularly around the question of material support, which really did. You're right, because we did work on that report together. It goes back to 1969. Two things. One is that the material support provisions really gained steam again after 9/11. And so the one thing, I guess it's a cautionary tale for folks that were around then. We were telling folks that the national security state that was being created in response to al-Qaeda was not just a strategy for al-Qaeda, it was actually a blueprint for future repression. And nobody believed it then. Half the people here weren't even alive during 9/11, but y'all know, and there's no shade there at all. I wish I wasn't.
Welcome to the world.
Exactly, but particularly for the people that were very young at the time, inherited a world in which that was the normal, and the rest of us were the proverbial frog in the boiling water. And by the time, so that's kind of a key thing, in that what we're witnessing now. And it's interesting. The other thing I wanted to say, Dylan, was thank you for giving that example. If we map on what Trump's strategy is and his rhetoric is now with respect to Palestine advocacy, it mirrors very much that very vague statute. It doesn't define what terrorism is, but it calls the people that are advocating for Palestinian liberation as tools of Hamas. And it doesn't, it's not clear on, it sends the message that whatever these folks are doing, it's bad news. And they also rely a lot on the idea of state secrets. And so that very often what you'll hear in these types of cases, it was true with Mahmoud's case and other cases, is, Judge, we can't tell you the intelligence that we have, but trust us, it's really, really bad. Now, we know these people are lying. And frankly, we knew that the Bush administration was lying back then, and they all lie about that stuff. As soon as they say we can't tell you, that's because they don't know. But it gets weaponized. And so that's the thing that I want to add to it, is that it's more than just a job for lawyers. I think it's very important for advocates and organizers to understand how this thing works. And as you know, Elisa was saying, that it's really your job to sort of stand firmly in an understanding of what's happening, rather than being sort of bounced around by the rhetoric that really clouds the question of anti-Semitism. It messes up the question about terrorism. But the clarity that you have, particularly in saying that genocide is wrong, killing people is wrong, starvation is wrong, it can never be right. And I will stand with the person that you say is a terrorist, because I know that they're not a terrorist because you're saying it. And that's the level of solidarity that I think we need to start building stuff around.
So I want to turn to Alicia Sanchez-Gill, who, as I mentioned earlier, is the indomitable leader of the Emergent Fund. For those of you who do not know what the Emergent Fund is, they are doing some of what I consider the most groundbreaking philanthropic work in rapid response funding to BIPOC, queer, and trans-led movements. Alicia is also, for those of you who do not know, someone who will embody movement in her core. She will put her body on the line and stand in solidarity across movements, and it's something that I've long appreciated and admired, but she brings that spirit to the way that you do this work and to the funding ecosystem. Emergent Fund was also one of the first philanthropic outfits, if not the first, that I certainly saw back in 2023, and I believe it was November 2023, calling on the philanthropic community to do things differently on Palestine. And so I want to turn to you, because you've been at the front lines of seeing how funders and the broader philanthropic community have been impacted by various lawfare efforts, and what that has played out and looked like. So if you can give us a little bit of color around that, that would be amazing.
Yeah, and thank y'all so much for having me. I don't take lightly anytime philanthropy is invited into the room, I'm very clear about the harm that philanthropy can do in movement spaces. And so really grateful to be here and to be doing work in partnership with movements in the container that we have while we have it, while we have philanthropy, until we don't need philanthropy anymore. And so I'll talk a little bit about why, thank you. I'll talk a little bit about why, what we saw at Emergent Fund in the wake of, as we watch genocide continue to unfold. And I'm kind of workshopping this. I've called it the 3 R's, so just go with me here. So I'll explain what I mean by that. So the first thing we saw is, and what we're continuing to see, is retraction. And so what I mean by that is just like the tightening of resources by philanthropy, and that is kind of writ large. We have seen philanthropy be tighter with their purse strings. We have seen philanthropy pull out funding, and I'll talk a little bit more about how that's looked. We've also seen what I call retrenchment. After 2020, funders were like, oh, we love Black people. We're gonna give Black people so much money. We're gonna be really abundant with resources. And also, we are going to shift our funding practices, right? We are going to give you funding with a lot of trust, right? Without a lot of restrictions. We're gonna lower the barriers for our movement partners. We are going to not ask for reporting, right? And what we've seen actually is a return to some of those really harmful funding practices, so I'm calling that retrenchment. And then the third is retaliation. And so how that looked is we saw a lot of Zionist funders in particular, and then funders we actually maybe didn't know were Zionist funders, and Zionist-aligned funders, pulling support from racial justice, from reproductive justice, from LGBTQ organizations who were publishing statements and on the front lines in solidarity with our Palestinian comrades, and in support of Palestinian liberation. And you'll notice I didn't say pulling support from Palestinian-led organizations, and that's because most of the organizations that we fund that were Palestinian-led were not getting funding from mainstream philanthropy to begin with, because that is often the third rail of philanthropic funding. Palestinian organizations receive so little funding to begin with. And so Emergent Fund, we are a movement-aligned, organizer-led rapid response fund. We were one of the first, as Had said, to put out a statement in support and solidarity with Palestinian liberation. And to be clear, that wasn't just to feel good, that wasn't to pat ourselves on the back. That was, one, so that our Palestinian comrades knew how to find us, right? And that was because they asked us, we wanted them to know that we were vocal and visible in our solidarity and our support of them and of Palestinian liberation. I always say that I don't love any institution more than I love Palestinian people being alive. I don't love any institution more than I love liberation. And so that was the risk that was worth taking. And then the other thing was that we wanted to provide funding for Palestinian liberation and for folks who were working in solidarity. And so we did that with many of our BMEMSA and often queer and trans-led other funders, right? When mainstream philanthropy was retracting, it was often queer and trans funders and other Muslim funders who were actually moving in to resource community. And that funding went to direct action, it went to safety and security, it went to legal support, it went to healing and mutual aid and convening so that folks could be on the front lines, but also so that folks could heal, right? So that folks could actually take time to gather together, so that folks could eat, right? So that folks could provide childcare at actions. And then we also organized resources for grantees. So we made sure it's not enough for Emergent Fund to kind of do a good job, right? We also have to be organizing philanthropy so that we can actually shift the field so that our grantees don't just have a good experience with us, but also have a good, a better experience in all of philanthropy. We know that movements have always relied on crisis moments to like really shift the zeitgeist of the moment, right? And we're seeing that right now as it relates to Palestine. As Alyssa said, we are seeing a dramatic shift in the way that the public is talking about Palestine right now. And this is an opportunity for dramatic shifting and change. And I think this is where, for Emergent Fund, this is where we really see our work at the intersection of emergent strategy and world building and rapid response. And as we're seeing this rise of fascism combined with a decreased appetite for risk from funders, we're just seeing kind of a constant state of movement chaos, right? But it's manufactured chaos, right? Because movement has, funders have everything they need to move resources to the front lines right now. The resources are there, and left philanthropy really has to kind of step up to move resources to our people and actually fund our people like we want people not just to survive, but to live and thrive. And so that's like really the role of Emergent Fund, is not just to move money, but to actually organize the field. There's a lack of access to open access funds like ours. And so we see that organizers who are on the front lines are constantly like on high alert, right? There's like this constant sense of manufactured scarcity that folks are dealing with because there's so few resources. Again, the resources are there, but it feels like there's so few resources. And then there's just like criminalization, like folks have already named, of our most basic democratic functions, from civic engagement to advocacy to organizing to political activity, and of course, to money. And money is really important, right? Because we know that our movements need organized people, organized ideas, and organized money, because, as much as like we don't like to talk about money on the left, money is power, right? And so our people need resources, our people need money in this moment. And maybe my last thought is that, we've funded at Emergent Fund many kinds of movements, everything from the fall of Roe to Standing Rock to being one of the first national funders to fund Stop Cop City, right? And this feels important because the connection between Stop Cop City and what is happening to Palestinian organizers is like these are shared tactics of repression, right, that are happening to our people, right? These same RICO charges that are impacting folks at Stop Cop City, right? The IDF is training the police department in Atlanta, right? All of these tactics of repression, chilled dissent, right? And people are being killed, abducted. This is not the time from philanthropy. So if you're in philanthropy, I'm talking to you. This is not the time for violent divestment from philanthropy. Left philanthropy really does have a duty to resource our people. And the Palestinian liberation, as folks have already named, really is a testing ground for all other forms of state violence and repression. And so we have to fund Palestinian-led organizing and the folks who are working in solidarity, like we know that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Clap. Go. Come on. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take moderator's privilege, and I'm going to actually jump over our second round of questions that I had in the interest of time. Lauren and Omar in the back in the orange t-shirts are going to be the amazing volunteers who signed up to help collect any questions that might be with you all. As those questions are getting collected and brought up here, I'm going to pose a different kind of question to you all, which is, one of the things that me and my team often say, and I think this is consistent with a number of movement organizers who know what the ebbs and flows of movement look like, is when the powers that be can't win a debate, they try to shut it down. And I think we're seeing that play out in real time right now. It is impacting those of us who care about Palestinian rights. It is impacting cross-movement allies in immigration, in racial justice, in abortion, in LGBTQ and trans organizing. The list goes on and on and on. My question that I want to pose to you all is, in this environment, what does it look like to flank movement? Mm-hmm. And anyone can jump in.
That's a fun question.
Anybody?
I
mean, I'm happy to start. I feel like the answer is very obvious for philanthropy, so I'm happy to speak on behalf of philanthropy. movements don't need philanthropy. Let me be clear, right? Our movements are bigger than philanthropy. We have mutual aid. We have Susu, right? Our communities are so philanthropic without philanthropic institutions, right? We organize money around kitchen tables. We find ways to, my mom every Thursday cooked for our entire neighborhood, even though we didn't have a lot. Like, we cooked for our whole neighborhood every Thursday. It was usually spaghetti. Black people love spaghetti. Side note. This is a side note. It was almost always spaghetti or rice and beans, right? We find ways to be giving and philanthropic in our communities no matter what, with or without resources. And that is the thing about our people, is we will find a way to do the work whether we have the money or not. And this is the time for philanthropy to be bold and giving right now, right? I know at Emergent Fund that it is never, sometimes philanthropy is often like trying to assess risk, right? Or we are saving money for a rainy day. It is pouring outside. If we were waiting for a rainy day, the time is now to give, right? And it is never a risk to fund our people. Our people know what we are doing. Our people are we can trust our people. We don't need restrictions on how we give, right? So now is the time for philanthropy to invest in bold giving, and to give abundantly, and to not be saving for a rainy day, because the organizing is happening, and fascism is already here, so we need to act like it's the right time to give. And so for me, the answer is that philanthropy needs to really dig in and move resources to the field now and for the long term, right? Rapid response is just one tool. Emergent Fund is a rapid response fund. We fund at the intersection of rapid response and emergent organizing, right? I'm very clear that rapid response is one tactic. All good organizing is paying attention to rapid response and movable moments. And I know that rapid response is one tool in long arc organizing, right? And so we need folks who can step in moments of heightened crisis, and folks who can stick it out for the long term, right? And this is money that already belongs to us. This is our community's money, because all philanthropy is built off of stolen land and stolen labor, right? And so this money needs to come home where it belongs, and so philanthropy needs to move this money back into the hands of our people right now.
Well.
So that's the role of philanthropy. Yeah. That's how we can flank movements.
That's amazing. And I also just want to offer, there were two questions that I think are related to this one around how do we flank our movements. How do we empower partners and allies to speak out and not comply in advance? What I call preemptive compliance, when that could potentially put them in the crosshairs of lawfare suits or other repressive tactics, is one question. The second one related to this is why is it important to refuse the emerging efforts to defang and de-radicalize the movement for Palestine in order to stave off McCarthyist tactics and attacks?
I can speak to that. So I think there's like two components to the response here. One is about Palestine itself, right? So we have been speaking to the ways in which Palestine is the testing ground for a lot of strategies and tools of repression that then spread to other movements. I think there's a really interesting question of why that is. That is actually harder to answer than it might seem on the surface. And it's kind of funny because, as a Palestine advocate, I'm often faced with the accusation of having singled out Israel. And like most kind of not so accusations, there is actually kind of a rational kernel there. Although it's not that we're singling out Israel, it's like why is defense of Israel so important to the United States? Which is a question that I've been asking myself repeatedly, in particular over the past 2 years, as we've all watched the United States effectively chase its global hegemonic position like Wile E. Coyote off the edge of a cliff into the abyss, as opposed to putting its foot down and ending a genocide, right? Like destroying the liberal international order and anyways, well, that's another conversation. But regardless of why, defense of Israel is vital to the United States. And so we do see a lot of these repressive tools cooked up in a lab effectively to repress the Palestine movement. But they won't stay there, and they don't stay there, right? So there's been a ton of headlines around, for example, HR 9495, which has been called the nonprofit killer bill. This is a bill that is not signed into law yet because people have sounded the alarm about it effectively. Who knows if that will continue to work? I think all it would take is a vote in the Senate right now for it to become law. That is a law that has dramatic implications for any C3, any registered nonprofit in the United States, because it would give the federal government the ability to effectively decide at will when they can just strip, or give them the ability to just strip that status. Now, a lot of the justification for that bill in terms of how people are talking about it, right, is around organizations, quote unquote, supporting terrorism in reference to Palestine advocacy. But we know, right, we know that it will not stop there. We know that it does not stop there. This is what we see time and time again, and there are many, many examples to draw from, right? So I'm super glad that you brought up Standing Rock and Stop Cop City, because those are avenues where we see the same kind of racialized weaponization of lawfare to try and repress political dissent and political organizing. Most visibly and perhaps critically in this moment is around immigrant justice, right? And because we're seeing literally direct crossover. We are seeing Palestine advocacy used as the justification for Gestapo-like snatch and grab operations where people are being pulled off the street for something as mundane as writing an op-ed in a school paper. So that connection is ongoing and concrete, and there are risks, prospective risks for where that can go, right? And I don't mean to fearmonger, but I think it is important to talk about, right? The Trump administration has started to designate cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. We don't know why they're doing that or where they're going. Maybe Vince does, I don't know. But when I see that, I start to get concerned that the same kind of material support for terrorism strategies that have been used to criminalize solidarity with Palestine will start to be used against the immigrant justice movement and be used to go at people who are organizing against ICE, et cetera. So that's kind of that's part of the why in terms of this will spread to other movements and other movements need to be aware of it. The other side of the story, right, is that capitulation doesn't work, right? So there is this idea that, okay, well, we'll just throw Palestine under the bus, right? They're the hot button issue. Everyone gets their feathers ruffled about Palestine, like they're the troublemakers. Maybe if we just let them have Palestine, they'll leave the rest of us alone. What we're seeing everywhere is it doesn't work. Capitulation doesn't work. And the example that's closest to home for me is around the private universities, right? Private universities in the post-October 7th period did everything in their power to suppress the student movement, right? They were suspending people, they were firing professors, they were banning clubs, they were doing everything that they could. They just wanted to roll over and show their belly to the donors, to the government, and it didn't work. The Trump administration is still fleecing them for millions of dollars and still putting on show trials at Congress because it's bigger than that, right? It's part of a larger ideological project to attack higher education and to advance right-wing interests. And so that's why it's not gonna work to throw Palestine under the bus. The same kinds of rhetorical tools and strategies that are used to weaponize anti-Semitism, it's not gonna stop with anti-Semitism. We're gonna see accusations of Hinduphobia in terms of attacking Hindu nationalism and support for Hindu nationalism in India. We already see a kind of parallel rhetoric in terms of opposing the movement for immigrant justice by playing on tropes of anti-white racism, right? There's so many, there's so much right-wing messaging about how this is immigrants pose a threat to the white family, et cetera, right? Those kind of rhetorical strategies, both in the national security and both in the weaponization of certain grievance-based identity attacks are not going to be limited to Palestine.
Thank you for that, Dylan. And I want to also just say, as we've been talking about this in the U.S. context primarily, what we're seeing play out in Gaza similarly has that effect. A genocide that goes unchecked for 21 months without accountability has massive ramifications for Palestinians and for every population around the globe. We are changing the norms around what genocide is and means and what can be done about it. And that is something that we should all be concerned about. And to remember that on one hand, we are seeing incredible movement here in the United States. I will say that I've been organizing on Palestine for the better part of my adult life, actually since I was a teenager, over 25 years now. The groundswell of movement here has been incredible. I've never seen the watershed moments that we're seeing. There are Palestinians dying right now. There is a genocide that is ongoing. And so in the immediate, as we're all thinking about, well, why do we keep our foot on the gas? Well, we need to stop the genocide, and it has implications for all of us. I want to just invite, we are going over time, but this has been a really rich conversation. You all have been incredible. I want to invite our panel before I close this out to just, if there's anything that's left on your heart, on your mind that you want to share with this audience.
Well, actually, I was thinking, I think one of the things about what you were just saying is, you don't actually have to be altruistic to take it, right? It's as organizers, we know self-interest makes the world go round. So, if that's what it's going to take for you to speak out around this and take a position on it as an organization, because it's going to, not doing so now is going to mean it's going to come back and bite your organization in the ass, then do it for that reason and motivate your people for that reason. It's it's not ideal, but we'll take what we could get, But I think in all seriousness, I do want to, I don't know most of you in this room, and so I don't know what your organizations are, but I really just want to make a heartfelt plea that, if you have not figured out a way to speak out in support of Palestinian liberation, if you have not figured out a way to take a stand against this genocide, you need to do that now. And you don't have to be an organization that works on Palestine. I think what we've talked about here, there's so many intersections. And it's just essential that you do, for all the reasons that we've talked about, for being in right relationship to whatever the divine is in your life, for being able to look back and not have to have that sense of guilt that you didn't. So I really want to implore you that you find whatever way it is, whatever your work is, to find your way to do that. And that can look like refusing to cooperate with organizations that are part of this genocide, and those include civil society organizations that masquerade as civil rights organizations, such as the Anti-Defamation League is one in particular, and other organizations that carry water for this genocide, just refusing to work with them, turning your people out to local actions, signing on to these broad letters that are going, there's a million different ways, but choose one and don't be that one that stood silent and then lives to regret it, and we all live with the repercussions of your silence.
Yeah, right on. Right. Yeah, I would love to add to that, because I've been thinking about this question of what can the people in this room do? So just to dovetail on that, so many of you are in organizations where you hear the following things. Oh, it's terrible what's going on, but we don't do that. I know but this is actually not the place where we're talking about this kind of stuff. And then some of you are in rooms when you're thinking about the big strategy for the midterms and the big strategy, and they're I think this Palestine stuff is really a distraction from what we're really trying to do, which is we're trying to get some asses in some seats for this midterm, right? So you're all hearing a lot of that stuff, and don't let it blow your head off. Breathe through it, and you have to come back the following way. Number one, we have to realize that change has never happened because of the power and brilliance of DC inside the Beltway organizations.
Okay.
Never happened. It also has not happened because the power and the brilliance of the lawyers. Change happens because people, well, except for maybe for Dylan, but change, he's actually really quite brilliant, and Yes. But we're out of time, people. We're out of time. What does happen continually, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, is that people come together in new formations that are outside of their family structures, outside of their religious structures, outside of their work structures, to come together around a values-based approach, and they're willing to risk something. So all of our workspaces, we got money, we get funding, people don't want to risk shit, right? They just want to win, right? And so we end up with a bunch of organizations that will have a lot of money in their endowment, and there will be nothing but dead people in Gaza. Right. And we can't let that happen. Right. So, yes, push internally, but the more important thing is to align yourself and connect with how the movement is being built right now. Right now. None of you are very strategic in the way that you approach your work. But we actually are not useful to the movement as strategists. We're useful to the movement as tacticians. Each one of you has an extraordinary skill, And so instead of having people spending a lot of time pulling together, how many calls have y'all been on about what's the big strategy, you know? And every funder except for the emergent fund is like calling me up, Vince, what do you think? I tell them what I think. They don't fund me. They do something stupid, and I'm like, I told you, you should ask me. But think about not so much about strategy. Let the movement, let the organizers talk about strategy, and let them deploy you as a tactician. You can write, yes. You can tweet, you can move. That's what we need.
You know, Vince is the closer.
Yeah, close the deal.
And we all have a conference ahead of us, so I'm going to invite everyone to stand up.
Oh. If you can.
And can you please give this amazing panel a round of applause? Give yourself a round of applause. The only way we win is we win together. And the only way we win is if we keep going. And so thank you all for being with us. Thank you for, if this is your first time learning about Palestinian rights organizing in the US and what's unfolding in kind of this nitty-gritty way, know that we're going to be around here. If you need help, support organizing your communities, we're going to hang out. So please feel free to come up. We'd love to stay in touch.